Hey guys, so for our tree mortality lab, I came back up to the Reservoir Ridge burn that we came to in the snow this year, and boy, it looks different. I encourage you, if you live in this area, to come up here and check it out. Looking at the ground, you can just see so much more evidence of more of the shrubs that were burned and completely sometimes and didn't even survive. So but for now, we're going to talk just about the trees and how to determine tree mortality. So as we talked a little bit about in our first trip up, we have a variety of severities of burns on these ponderosa pine trees in this area. And what we want to look at is how likely are these trees to survive, or how likely are they to die? I'm going to flip the camera around here and show you. So as we scan through this, it should look somewhat familiar. Some trees still have green, some trees have some red, some trees are pretty charred. So let's talk for a minute about why does it matter for us to determine if a tree is likely to survive? So we know whether or not we feel super bad about the burn or not bad. No, probably not. So let's think about reasons why it matters whether or not a tree survives. Well, first of all, when these trees die, right, they're probably not going to fall over right away. So as they die and quit growing, they become really good wildlife trees. So that might be one reason why we'd care if a fire kills a tree. So we know if we're going to have wildlife trees on site when they're done. The reason they become good wildlife trees is because they become easy to get hollowed out. They host more insects for birds to feed on, and they can become good perching sites for our raptors. So generally, they become snags, and that makes a good wildlife tree. So that might be one objective to know. Another reason might be if these trees are near a trail or a road, they could become a hazard tree if they're going to fall over. The other thing that we would want to know is if there's any logging possibility. So we have what we call salvage logging that may come in after a site and just take out those trees that are likely to die, and we might be able to get some kind of revenue off of that. Especially when we're talking about bigger areas in like the national forest, they might want to come in and log out the trees that were likely to die while the wood is still sound before it gets rotten. So those are some of the primary reasons why we'd want to know if the tree is likely to survive or not. The other things are really thinking about the prescription. If this was a prescribed burn, which this site was not, so don't get confused there, but if this was a prescribed burn, we would want to know if we've met our objectives. So some of those objectives might be things like, if we light a fire and we have that prescribed burn, we might hope that we get 30% mortality on this site in order to reduce our density of trees. We might hope to get kill on a certain diameter of tree, a certain class of diameters. You might want to reduce things under 10 inches, reduce the number of trees under 10 inches. You might want to maintain trees that are over 20 inches. So all these things can be written into the stand. You can go back and do an inventory afterward and see how successful you are at meeting those objectives. And again, maybe watershed health, maybe soil burn severity, some other things that we can get an idea of the severity of the fire by looking at tree mortality. So when you look at why a tree might die, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason a tree might die is because it no longer has the ability to produce food. And that is if it doesn't have the ability to produce leaves because the buds are gone. So you can see on this lower branch, some of these buds on this ponderosa pine were completely burned and don't stand a chance. Here's a good example right here. See if I can get that in focus. They don't really stand a chance of re-budding and having leaves come out. So that would be one reason why the tree might not survive. The other is if they don't have enough of the canopy left, it's usually a proportion of the whole canopy that it could reproduce buds, and of the area that's scorched, how much of that tree does it have to replace needles on in a given year? So if you look at some trees, like this one, right, it has some scorch there on the bottom, but it still has some green needles on the top. And even though it's going to have to replace some of those needles, a lot of the trees just still working, and it still has good green needles, and those needles can provide enough food so that the tree can use some reserves to just replace the damaged needles down below, and hopefully those buds aren't burned. And we talked about on the field trip, sometimes those needles will close up around the bud to protect the bud from the heat. So we have the percent of the canopy that was still green and not scorched, can allow that tree to survive. We can have the percent of the canopy that had bud scorch, you know, above a certain threshold there, it may die. So we look at bud scorch, we look at needle scorch, and we can also look at the effect on the bark itself. So we know with trees like ponderosa pine that they have this thick bark, and even though, like in some of these trees, you see that the boles of these trees are very blackened, but the odds are that as long as the charring isn't deep, the cambium layer underneath could still be good. So in your thicker bark species like ponderosa pine and older Doug fir, you can have quite a bit of bark severity and burn, and still have survival of the cambium layer underneath. We'll talk more about looking at that in a minute. But your thinner barked species, it doesn't take very much for those trees to die because the cambium underneath can heat up. So we want to look at the percent of bark char on the bole as well. So can the tree still make new cells with the cambium? Is enough of the phloem still intact that it can transfer sugars from the leaves down to the roots? And can the leaves themselves produce sugars? Those are really the main things we're looking at to see if a tree survives. And what's quite amazing is you can look at an area like this and think there's going to be quite a few trees that die, and then 3 years later they've greened up and it's looking pretty healthy, and you can still see evidence of the burn on the bark, but the tree themselves have survived. So there's a couple different ways to determine tree mortality, and I've actually designed this lab so that you can practice with 2 different systems. The first is really simple. However, it was only developed for ponderosa pine, and it is fairly regionally specific. So it's been tested in Oregon, has not been tested in Colorado for its accuracy. However, the east slope of the Oregon forest is pretty similar to the east slope of our Front Range here, kind of a drier ponderosa pine dominated forest. So I think that we could translate these techniques between the 2 sites, but that's just a caveat. And this is a technique that I'm going to refer to as the Malheur model. All right. And so the 2 things that we're going to look at in the Malheur model are proportion of the tree that got scorched, that its needles got scorched, and proportion of the bole that the bole got scorched, so of the trunk. And I didn't say that exactly right. It's the proportion of the crown that the needles were scorched and the proportion of the bole that got scorched. So the nice thing is you don't need any tools for this. You do need to print out this guide right here, or if you don't, you could make something very similar to this, but it's just a proportion gauge from 0 to 1. So when I look through, I'm going to fold it, by the way, so I printed it and I just folded that sign so that I can line up the base of the crown with 0 and the tip of the crown with 1. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hold this out and close one eye, and as I look at it, I want the base of the crown to be at about 0 and the tip of the crown to be right about 1. And so the base of the crown is like what we've talked about. It's really where the branches start coming out. In this model, it says it's where 3 or more branches come out at once. And I will want to do this from another angle just to make sure that I'm kind of have the average if the branches aren't quite even. So I look at this with 0 down here at the base, 1 up there at the tip top, and I want to read up my gauge to about the level where I think the scorching kind of ends. And in my site right there, I'd say I'm really close to the 4. There's a little bit of scorching higher up, but the majority of the scorching in my observations here ends at about 4, maybe 4.5 or 0.4 or 0.45. So as I do that, I want to remember that, write it down on my data sheet, which I'll show you how to do later when we actually talk about the techniques. So that's the percent of the scorch height. And later on, you'll use that on the x-axis here in the graph. I'll come back to that. Then we want to do the same thing for the bull scorch. So I put the 0 at the base of the tree where it touches the ground. And I actually want the 1 to be at the top of the tree. So I'm going to have to move a little bit in order to do the bull scorch. So I've moved back, and I'm going to hold this 0 at the base of the tree. And as I look up, 1 is going to be where the top of the bowl is, not necessarily where the top of the needles are though. So be careful with that. And then what percentage from 0 to 1 is that bowl char? And I'd say I'm right at about 2 for the bowl char. So I have 0.2 for the bowl char and 0.45 for the crown scorch. What I would do then is come in here and go to 0.45, and I'm going to come up to that 0.2 level. And then my probability of that tree surviving, so here's the 0.2 and here's the 0.45, is between 0.1 and 0.2. So that tree only has about a 15% chance of dying. So that's pretty good. There's a pretty strong chance that that tree is going to live. Okay, so now that we've gone over the specific technique with each tree on to figure out whether or not, or what its probability of survival, probability of mortality is, that's what the 15% was, 15% chance of mortality on that tree. Now I want to talk about the overall lab. How are you going to set it up? How do we sample this area? Well, I want you to do a transect. And transect is a running line, and this is similar to a belt transect where you have a little bit of a width on each side of your line. So the first thing is to determine where do you start your transect. The best way to do this is kind of determine the perimeter of your burn area, and actually from the perimeter, choose some kind of randomly pick a number, maybe it's 15, and you're going to pace that distance from the edge of your burn area. And in what direction? Well, random is best. So what you can do is take a pen or a pencil, and I'm kind of pretending I'm not on the edge of my burn area right now, but let's pretend that I am. And I toss my pencil says to go that way. So that would be the direction I would take my transect, all right? So I would pace in, let's say 15 paces, and that is where I would start my transect. So if this is my initial point for my transect needs to run 100 feet along the direction of my random toss pencil, all right? A better way to do this would be if you had a compass. You would randomly pick an azimuth between 0 and 360 if you were in the middle of your burn, or maybe 0 and 90 if you're on the edge of the burn, whatever direction would put you into the burn. But we're gonna make do with tools that you're gonna have at home. So I toss my pencil, I want it to go this way. Now I need to know where my transect ends. So what might work best is actually to mark the beginning of your transect and then work backwards. You can do it either way. If you know your pace, you can do it either way. But a pace, for me, if I don't have a tape measure, which I tried to not bring any tools that you're not going to have, this is really, really important little side note is to know your pace. So know how many steps it takes you to take for 100 feet. We're going to use that in so many different places and natural resources, and you'll find yourself without a measuring device more times than you can count. So I know that I have actually 20 paces per 100 feet, and I just want to demonstrate a pace, guys. Since we haven't done it in this class, you start with your feet together, and it's where one foot hits to where that same foot hits again. So that was one pace. So I'm going to do that for about 100 feet. And then I'm going to come back to my water bottle that I marked on the ground. Okay, so I'm at the end of my 100 feet, and you can see I went ahead and put my notebook down so you can see it a little bit better. That's the end of my transect. So ideally I'd have a partner here doing this with me, but we're social distancing, right? So here's my imaginary line. And also if you have 100-foot tape, that's just even better. Lay it down and then your line is secure. You're going to then do what we did for that first tree on 15 feet on either side of my transect line. So as I look at that, I'd say this tree right here is probably within 15 feet. That tree right there is probably within 15 feet. And that tree right there is probably within 15 feet. So I don't have to walk my transect. I can just record data for those 3 trees. So I'm looking at the first tree that I said would have been in along the width of my transect within that 15 feet. I want to do the same technique, all right? I want to determine the percent of the crown that was scorched. And this one has a much higher percentage. I would say this one is really probably at about 0.85. And of the bull scorch, it's different on both sides of the trees. And so when it's different, if it's only burned to this high on one side and this high on the other, you want to average that for what you're saying is the height of the burn char. So for the bull on this one, I would say it's at about 0.3 as the average burn char of the bull. So we had 0.3 for the burn char and about 0.85, I think, for the canopy scorch. All right, so here's what this looks like on your data sheet. You're going to put your name there. If you have a GPS, go ahead and record the coordinates. If you don't worry about it. This is my first transect. I'd like you to do 3 if you can. That was tree number 1. And we need to assess, does it look like it was dead before the burn? And I'll talk a little bit later about how to do that. Does it look like it was killed in the fire? Or if this has been a few years, you can do this assessment up to 3 years post-fire. And so maybe the tree died completely after the fire, we would put PFM. At this moment, because there's still green on that tree, I'm going to call this tree alive. It doesn't mean it's going to stay alive, but I'll put an A there for there. And of the bull scorch proportion, I think I said 0.3. And I'll have to double check the video there. And of the crown scorch proportion, I said 0.85. So those are my 2 numbers, 0.85 and 0.3. I'm going to do that for every tree on the transect. So transect 1, tree number 2, it still has a tad bit of green. I still need to assess it. Transect, or tree number 3 is the one we did at the beginning, and it was still alive. It had a bull scorch of 0.2, and it had a crown scorch of 0.45, I believe. And so I want to do that for every tree in our transect. And then you can do this later at home, or you can do it in the field. You're going to look at the probability of mortality. So we already did this one here, and we said it's only got a 0.15 chance of dying. So let's do it for 0.3 and 0.85. So we're going to come up. Of the crown scorch was all the way over here, but the bull scorch was a 0.3. So I'm going to draw that up, and notice that it's on this 0.6 line. So that tree has a 0.6 or a 60% chance of dying. So we'd put that here. And for our last tree in my transect, there's a little bit of green, just barely on it. The crown scorch went up almost all the way, so I gave it a score of 1. The bull scorch was at 0.4, and that gave it a probability of mortality of 0.8. So that would finish out my first transect. I'd like you to do 2 more transects if you can. You can either do them end to end, or you can do them parallel to each other. But if you're parallel to each other, you need to make sure that you're at least 50 feet apart from where you were to begin with, so that you're not counting the same trees in your 15 feet on each side of the transect. So do three total if you can. So transect 2 would start underneath it, and you'd start over with tree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however many trees you have in that transect. And that's the simple Malheur model. Go ahead and end that one. So what I've described so far is what I want you to do that's required. Now, just for fun, because I know you guys always want extra, I'd like you to try this other method if you have the time to do it. And this is actually a very recent method. It's only been published for a year or 2, and it is what I'm referring to as the post-fire assessment of tree status. It's the Hood et al. Method. And you have a field guide for that online as well. So hopefully you've read that before you come out here. But what it's looking at is, the nice thing about this model is it assesses all different types of species, where the Malheur model was just for ponderosa pine. This model, you can do a variety of different tree species, but it looks at slightly different things. So the first thing that it's going to look at is the circumference of the bole that has experienced charring. The second thing it's going to look at is the proportion of the needles that the buds have been burnt off of. So this is what I want to take a closer look at right now. If I hold up this white sheet of paper, possibly behind these, you might be able to see this a little bit better. So this twig is blackened, right? The needles have literally been burned off. It is not likely that that bud is going to survive. So when I'm looking at this tree, I want to determine what percentage of the canopy has these blackened needles or completely burned off versus the red scorched needles that we've been looking at before. So these blackened needles indicate that these buds are not going to survive. And once we've determined what percentage of the crown has the blackened needles, we'll determine how much of the crown can have the red scorched needles and still be surviving. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. To determine the percentage of the blackened charred needles and the percentage of the red scorched needles, use the same technique. Hold up your little ruler thing for the proportion of that canopy, and you can then estimate how many of those branches experience the blackened needles, what proportion of the whole crown, and what proportion of the whole crown has the red scorched needles. So if we look at the proportion of the bole that experience deep charring, on a ponderosa pine, that's all that really matters. As far as bole charring goes, is what's happening down here at the base. And what is referred to as deep charring is charring that you can't tell the texture of the bark anymore because it's basically burned that up. So this is actually not, this is probably moderate charring, maybe even light charring for a ponderosa pine. And again, I encourage you to look at your field guide pictures for what deep charring is versus moderate charring. And, ooh, that's sappy. And you want to know what percentage of the circumference of this tree has deep charring. So as I look around, I can still see the unique texture of ponderosa pine all the way around. I would say 0% of this tree has deep charring, even though 100% of the circumference does have some moderate charring. All that really matters for ponderosa pine is that deep charring. And I know that by looking at this rubric that I've provided to you that they've made, and I'll show you how to use this in a little bit. The last thing that you need to look at with this other model is evidence of insect activity or insect attack since the fire. So a lot of trees don't die from the fire, but they die from the stress of the insects attacking them after a fire. So we're looking for pitch tubes or evidence of boring dust. And pitch tubes are like little popcorn resinous balls on the tree. They're not these long drippy sap. So even though there is evidence of this tree kind of sapping out a little bit, I don't think that that is from an inner bark borer. I could be wrong, but I would go ahead and count this as no evidence of pitch tubes, even though we have some evidence of sapping. Boring dust is just literally dust like sawdust coming out of the tree, and you'd see it in little piles, or you'd see it kind of piling up on the grooves of the bark wherever is below the insect. And so the last thing you need to look at is what proportion of this circumference has evidence of pitch tubes or boring dust. So if you want to use this second assessment, the post-fire assessment field guide that I've just been discussing, you can do it for the same transects in the same trees that you're using for the Malheur model. So let's say, and this actually is, this was still transect 1 and tree number 1 that I've been looking at, and it is still alive. Oops. And I need to see how many of these I can check off. So is less than or equal to 75% of the bowl have deep charring? I said yes, it was almost 0, so I can put a check there. And then I can look at it and say, does less than 10% of the needles or of the crown, is it blackened? Yeah, probably less than 10%. So if it's less than 10%, then I have to go over here and go, okay, so and this should be is less than 15%, or is at least 15% of the crown green? That's correct. So if I'm less than 10% blackened, then I can say, all right, so is at least 15% of the crown green? And I would actually say no on that one, so I wouldn't check that. Now let's say I had more than 10% of the tree blackened. If more than 10% of the crown has blackened needles, then I have to have at least 60% of the crown green instead of 75% green. And I don't know why they write it that way, but so I can't check this box because this tree does not meet this criteria or this criteria. And then I can come over here and go pitch tubes or boring dust across less than 50%. Yeah, it meets that criteria. So in order for the tree to survive, I have to have a check mark in all 3 of these. And since I don't, then it's likely that this tree is going to die, which is pretty similar to what the Malheur model gave us of, yeah, it's got more than an 80% chance of dying. So I would do this checklist for each tree along my transect, the same trees that you count for the Malheur model. And you know what? You just never know what you're going to get when you're out doing field work. I think we can all agree we like wildlife. There's a small herd of about 6 deer or so that are about 20 yards from us, and we've just been chatting it up. And they're just grazing in this new burn area. I guess that kind of goes along with what we've been learning about the effects of fire and how much wildlife like them. Bunch of mamas and some young ones. This is taken on April 1st. Not seeing any antlers. That could be because they would have just started growing, but we're pretty close to this group. I think that's probably all doe. So your data sheet asks you to determine if the tree is dead, which this one is obviously dead. Did it die since the fire, or did it die before the fire? So if a tree was dead in the fire, if the tree was dead before the fire, you're not going to see any fine needles. If we zoom into some of these branches, you'll see that it's just the thicker twigs. You don't see any of the finer twigs, no needles. And so it's likely that this tree had died before this area burned. And so that's why you're not seeing any scorching of the needles, because they were gone before the fire. If the tree has died since the fire, because this fire is so new, you could count it dead if there's no green left on the tree at all. Even this tree right here has some green left up top there. It's probably not going to make it. You would actually still call that one alive. But if I came back next year, you wouldn't see any green. You wouldn't see any orange from the needles because they'll have fallen off by then, but you would still probably see some of those fine twigs and buds where those needles were during the fire, and you would know that it had died since the fire. So a post-fire mortality. So that's about it, folks. Try and get out. This is that area that we came to along Horsetooth Reservoir, Reservoir Ridge. Any area that's been burned in the last 5 years, though, should work for this. You might have you'll probably find some post-mortality burns versus burned in the fire. Right now it's so fresh, we wouldn't have very many post-fire mortalities because we haven't had a growing season to be able to determine that yet.